This series was originally recorded in 2023. Since then, the number of students disclosing disabilities has increased. According to the 2025 AAMC Graduation Questionnaire All Schools Summary Report, 12.7% of graduating U.S. medical students reported a disability. However, only 42.9% of those students received accommodations. While this increase in disclosure is encouraging, new research is uncovering even more barriers than we originally thought. We still have a lot of work to do. For now, we hope you enjoy part 1 of this 3-part series. This is the Docs with Disabilities Podcast. I'm Sophia Schlossman, and today we're beginning something new. A series about a single word, a word that carries weight in medicine: disclosure. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll hear from medical students, residents, doctors, and healthcare providers with disabilities, people from all levels of training and practice, about what it means to disclose a disability in healthcare spaces. This series is about lived experience. It's about the fear that can accompany the decision of whether to disclose, and the courage it can take to do so. And it's also about the continued silence of so many, and the conditions that make disclosure feel risky or simply impossible. Welcome to the Disclosure series.
What is disability disclosure?
When we hear the phrase disability disclosure, it's often framed as a transaction. You disclose, and in return, you receive accommodations. But for many people, disclosure is far more complicated than that. At its simplest, disclosure is the choice to share information about one's disability with others. But that choice is rarely neutral. It's shaped by timing, by trust, by the question of whether the space you're in feels safe or not. For some, disclosure is a way of explaining an absence, a pause, a detour in a training path that doesn't fit neatly into institutional timelines. It's a way of saying, there's more to the story than you can see. For others, disclosure is about connection, about finding community, about signaling to someone else, quietly or explicitly, that they're not the only one navigating this space in a body or mind that doesn't match the expected mold. For many people, disclosure is also about identity, about claiming a part of oneself that has too often been framed as a problem to manage, rather than a reality to respect. And sometimes, disclosure is an act of resistance. Disability scholar Neera Jain offers another way of thinking about disclosure. She writes about what she calls political disclosure, the idea that some people disclose not to request support, but to resist erasure, to make disability visible in environments that often work hard to keep it invisible.
How I describe it in the paper is that it's disclosure for collective benefit in resistance to ableist pressures to normalize or otherwise conceal disability. So there's this kind of, in the space of health professions education, especially medical education, a pressure to appear quote unquote normal, to be as quote unquote normal as possible, to look normal, to conceal one's disability, to not stand out. But what students told me is the ways that they shared their disability experience, both in direct resistance to that idea, that feeling that that's not okay, and that's not helping anyone.
And in reality, disclosure is rarely just one thing. Most often, it's a combination of needs and timing, of relationships and risk, of personal history and the conditions someone finds themselves in at that moment. Disclosure has been a recurring theme on the Docs with Disabilities Initiative podcast. Across episodes of this podcast, guests repeatedly return to their experiences with disclosure, often describing fear, uncertainty, or careful calculation tied to other identities they hold. In episode 71, for example, Dr. Meek spoke with Dr. Ann Messman, an emergency medicine physician and associate dean of graduate medical education at Wayne State University School of Medicine. Dr. Messman described what it feels like to disclose again and again.
When I decided I was going to tell everybody that I had MS and that that's why I have this limp that I walk around with, I just sent an email on our listserv that went to all the residents and all of the physicians, faculty, and clinical, and just said, I have MS, that's why I limp. But that was about 3 years ago. So some of those residents have graduated. We have some new faculty. it almost feels like it's something I need to send like every couple of years, which feels really uncomfortable. So when there's people, either new residents, faculty, or nursing staff that I haven't worked with very much, patients, of course, they usually just very overtly, I can tell that they're watching me. I can tell that they're looking at me funny, and they'll say, "Hey, doc, what's wrong with your leg? Why are you walking like that?"
Other guests have described a different dynamic. Pediatric hospitalist Dr. Amy Rule spoke about navigating disclosure of a more apparent disability, and the concern that if she did not frame the narrative herself, others would do it for her.
I knew I was going to get questioned. And so I came up with answers that I was okay with. I went in trying to be able to come up with a narrative where, like, my disability is an asset. It's a diversity asset. It's an asset because your patients look like me. And having a pediatrician that looks like the children that I care for, potentially that matters.
Section 1. What the data tells us.
So what do the data tell us about disclosure? To better understand the broader context, I spoke with Dr. Karina Pereira-Lima, a researcher at the University of Michigan whose work focuses on disability among healthcare trainees.
We have different prevalence estimates depending on the type of data that we are talking about. So if we consider data coming from confidential surveys among medical students and residents, the prevalence of graduating U.S. medical students with disabilities and first-year U.S. resident physicians with disabilities is estimated to be about 9%. If we consider school-reported data, we have a prevalence of about 6% of medical students formally registered with their school disability services. The good news is that the proportion of medical students and residents with disabilities has been increasing. If we look at school-reported data, the prevalence of medical students registered with their school disability services more than doubled since 2015. And the bad news is that while this prevalence is increasing, students and residents with disabilities are still greatly underrepresented in medicine. National data from the United States estimate that about 1 in every 4 Americans live with a disability, which is a way higher proportion than the proportions estimated among medical trainees.
So there's a gap. About 9% of medical trainees report having a disability, but many don't request the accommodations they need.
We found that about half of medical students and about a quarter of resident physicians with disabilities request accommodations. But what we also found is that about 1 in every 5 medical students and about 1 in every 2 resident physicians with reported need for accommodations do not request them. We also found that among residents who don't request accommodations when needed, about 60% report fear of stigma or bias as a reason to not request, and 24% reported the lack of a clear institutional process as a reason to not request needed accommodations.
Dr. Pereira-Lima also emphasized that disclosure is not synonymous with seeking accommodations.
While seeking accommodations can be one of the reasons why trainees choose to disclose a disability, it is certainly not the only reason. For example, some students decided to disclose their disabilities as a way to counter stigma and stereotypes and to combat negative views of disability in medicine. Some students choose to disclosure as a way to participate in disability community and advocacy. Others because they know that their personal experiences with healthcare systems are valuable to medical education and training. We have students who choose to disclosure because they have a lot of disability pride and they have so much disability knowledge to share. On the other hand, we also have this fear of negative consequences and this lack of institutional support that can counter a trainee's decision to disclosure.
Section 2. The decision to disclose.
In short, the decision to disclose disability or chronic illness is complicated, and the decision-making process often begins early, sometimes as early as the medical school application itself. This was the case for Blake Harden, a medical student with short bowel syndrome.
My whole experience then, living with a chronic illness, was why I decided to go into medicine in the first place. So It was a kind of difficult decision, but I ultimately decided to go ahead and disclose. I didn't give specifics, but I said that I have a chronic illness, and my experiences shaped my perception of healthcare and medicine and motivated me to pursue a career in healthcare. I was accepted to medical school. I decided to make a social media post basically saying that I was fortunate enough to receive great care from Mott Children's Hospital as a part of the University of Michigan, and that I will be returning to the University of Michigan Medical School to receive my MD. My decision to disclose my chronic illness, it was not an easy one. I'm in a position where I feel like I can share my experience. I hoped that my experience can serve as a teaching point for healthcare professionals and future healthcare professionals to pay closer attention when they care for patients with disabilities and chronic illnesses, to show them compassion and understanding and respect, and to listen to them, and to acknowledge that they face disparities within our healthcare system.
Blake describes how disclosure of his disability identity, although a difficult decision, enabled him to present an authentic narrative during the medical school admissions process, and to act as an advocate for patients and an educator of his classmates and colleagues. While these strategic disclosure decisions can be incredibly powerful and empowering, navigating this process alone can also be very overwhelming. For our next contributor, a medical student who preferred to remain anonymous, the presence or absence of supportive mentors, friends, and colleagues played a central role in shaping the path toward disability disclosure.
When I began working on my medical school applications, my pre-med advisor at my undergraduate institution advised me not to disclose my chronic illness in my primary application, as it could be perceived as a significant weakness. This frustrated me because my disability had fundamentally transformed my life and become a crucial part of my identity and motivation for pursuing a career in medicine. My experiences as a patient has undeniably made me a more compassionate individual and highlighted my resilience in managing my academics during college. My application was strong overall, and I didn't want to believe that disclosing this aspect of my life would undermine the rest of my hard work.
Finding the right support matters. This contributor ultimately chose to disclose strategically.
I ended up working with an advisor outside of my undergraduate institution, as well as one of my closest mentors, because I really needed people who could understand my circumstances and my purpose, and help me make informed decisions. I wanted to disclose the fact that I have a disability/chronic illness, but I needed schools to know that I could still meet their technical standards, so I made sure to mention that my condition has remained stable, and I continued leading a productive life. I wanted schools to view my lived experiences as a whole.
Using this strategy and this support, the student was accepted and committed to medical school. When they matriculated, however, the new environment within their institution again affected their disclosure decision-making.
Upon committing to my medical school, I promptly reached out to the Student Affairs Department to identify the individuals responsible for coordinating accommodations, as the process can be time-consuming. For me, the choice to disclose my disability to the Student Affairs faculty who support me was more of a necessity than a choice. Although the process was not flawless, I feel incredibly fortunate to be at a school with a select group of faculty dedicated to supporting students like me in navigating their education while managing their health. Initially, I had intended to publicly disclose my disability at my school. However, I quickly learned that despite progress, there is still significant stigma surrounding students with disabilities. Therefore, I have chosen to disclose my disability only to my closest colleagues and in small group settings where I feel comfortable doing so.
Section 3. What disclosure looks like, logistical and political.
The complexity of disclosure is central to this series. As mentioned, one way to think about disclosure is as a logistical step, something required to gain access. Another way is as resistance. Dr. Neera Jain, a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland, describes this as political disclosure.
There was this kind of predominant idea that we had that students didn't want to disclose, especially students, in particular students with less apparent disabilities, that they just weren't going to talk about their disability unless they had to. But talking to students, what was really interesting was that they were telling me something else. And that was that there were all these different ways, large and small, that they were sharing their disability experience, and that it was driven by this desire for change. So I called that political disclosure to kind of differentiate it from the logistical disclosure, that I need something for myself in order to get access. And so therefore I need to disclose. And that they did it, as I say, in large and small ways. So, for example, a student who had experienced mental health related experiences, and they were taking a leave of absence. And they said, I emailed my whole class because I want them to know what's going on. I'm not going to hide it. And I think it's important for them to know that this is happening, to recognize that this is a concern in our field and that it's not shameful. Was just this really kind of bold step to email. As the student described, their program was saying to them, I don't know if that's a good idea. Is that safe? Are you going to regret it after you tell everyone what's going on with you? And they said, I'm doing this anyways. We need to talk about this. So that's like a big kind of bold statement.
And for every moment like that, public and unmistakable, there are many more moments that happen quietly, outside of the spotlight.
But then there were these really small ways, and even students who really talked about being concerned about stigma, all the students talked about stigma, but there were some that were more worried about it than others, and yet would talk about the ways that they made these small disclosures kind of one-on-one with other people. Sometimes when they knew that other person also had a lived experience of some type, or just, they're having a lesson where they're talking about their disease that they have and saying, you know what, I'm going to share my experience because something's missing from this conversation. And that's maybe a smaller scale, maybe in a small group, or just one-on-one with people. And so it was on all these different levels, but it was always kind of for this larger purpose, not just for, I need something, I need access. It was about education and change.
This idea of political disclosure not only to seek accommodations, but to build community, promote inclusion, or strategically pursue change, came up again and again in our conversations. One person who spoke powerfully about this was Dr. Davy Ran, an internal medicine physician with specialized training in working with people with disabilities and trans patients. Dr. Ran reflected on the role that disclosure and disability justice has played throughout their life and career.
For me, I actively choose to disclose to find community. I choose to disclose to destigmatize disclosure. I choose to disclose because it's something that's a huge part of who I am and brings me joy and brings me, for me personally, because I'm hard of hearing, there's an incredible culture and community and history, deaf culture, and that I want to engage in. So when I think of disclosure, to me, it's very similar to coming out, as in there's something that maybe some people might consider less acceptable in society. People might not assume that is part of who you are. And you have to say, hey, I'm actually part of what might be perceived as other. I'm actually different than what you are assuming based on the norm. I have both been out as queer and out as disabled for many, many, many years in all the possible ways. But at the same time, it's an ongoing process because people will always assume they know what your sexuality is, what your gender is, what your body is, what your body does with other bodies, what your body does in society. And I think it's all part of this issue of kind of assuming that there is a certain type of way to exist in our community that many people don't. And a lot of that is both their body, but also the way their body interacts with the community around it.
Dr. Ran also talked about how the very word disclosure can feel more or less appropriate depending on the context, and how the term itself carries assumptions.
The word disclosure, I know we want it to be neutral, but I think there is an element of like admitting, sort of a negative thing. Like it's not something you're joyful to explain to people, something you're excited to explain to people, something you volunteer. You have to disclose it. There has to be a moment where you sit people down and it's all very serious. That's the way I think disclosure sounds. Whereas in reality, a lot of times that's not what it is. If I'm talking to someone in community, sometimes I make jokes like, oh, I'm coming out to you. I'm hard of hearing. But a lot of times it'll be like, oh yeah, I just like, I'm part of the community. I'm one of you guys.
Section 4, the daily reality of disclosure.
Disclosure isn't a one-time event. For many healthcare trainees, it's a daily negotiation. Dr. Irene Sturgiopoulos, a psychiatrist and disability researcher, describes what that can look like in practice.
Disclosure is complicated. There are so many different levels of disclosure. It's like, how much do you disclose? When do you disclose it? Who do you disclose it to? It's a daily act. It is not just like, I think we think about disclosure oftentimes as like, I've disclosed. Now either the doors have opened or they have remained closed. But it's not. It's like a daily thing when you're in medical school. And so the way that I think about it and what we've seen in research, like what I've seen in my personal life, what I've seen with learners who I've been kind of supervising as a senior resident, is like it's such a daily practice and such a daily act. Because for example, like let's say, you have an accommodation, you've disclosed to the school, you've disclosed to maybe like a couple of friends, you've disclosed to a couple of preceptors, but you have a different preceptor in clerkship like every day sometimes. And so let's say you have to leave early for an appointment. Will you disclose that you have that accommodation to your preceptor that day? Well, you might need to be able to take the accommodation.
That kind of daily calculation can be exhausting. And for some trainees, disclosure isn't a choice. It's immediate. To understand what disclosure looks like when disability is visible, we spoke with Kaja Siddiqui, who shared how disclosure shows up in day-to-day clinical training.
I have metaphyseal chondrodysplasia, which just means that I have a type of achondroplasia, which the common colloquial term is probably dwarfism, but it has an added layer of some joint involvement. So my joints don't open up all the way, more particularly like my elbows and my knees. So for that, I use a power wheelchair in my day-to-day work and in school and things like that. The moment I walk into the office or walk onto the floor, it's, I have this disability. But when it comes to disclosure, for someone with a visible disability, the disclosure part allows you and the person that you're working with know what you can do and what you may need help with. Although, like, I use a wheelchair, that doesn't mean that I can't do all the aspects of the physical exam. So in our OSCEs, we have standardized patients, and oftentimes I ask them, okay, so for this next part, we're going to be doing a physical exam. Is it okay if I ask you to sit in this chair? So they just get off and they sit in the chair. But then if you think about like now on the floor, I can't just ask a patient to, get out of their bed and sit in the chair. So for this, I usually have the nurse or some other people that are on the team, or I myself will like move the table that the patient has like eating, like their dining table that comes onto the bed, move that over, or even ask the patient, is it okay for me to lower this bed? And then they say okay, and then I just push the button and the bed goes down. Luckily, the rooms have been big enough for me to use my chair and do a proper physical exam. So I think the disclosure part for people with a visible disability is allowing people to know what it is that you can do and what you need help with. Because even though like it's very obvious that I'm in a wheelchair, they don't know what I can do while in the chair.
Even when a disability is apparent, there's still nuance. What's shared, how it's shared, and with whom. We hear this again from disability scholar Neera Jain, who emphasizes that this kind of strategic decision-making cuts across disability types.
I think about Heather Evans's work on uncovering disability, and her work was focused on people with less readily apparent disabilities and talked about the ways that they authored their disability identity by covering and uncovering their disability experiences. And interestingly, I saw that also with people with more readily apparent disabilities who use wheelchairs. Those people talked also about, like, it's not so simple as, I have a disability, therefore, what I need, what barriers I encounter. They also have strategically described, disclosed what barriers they were encountering in relation to this idea of stigma.
Section 5. When disclosure goes wrong.
Not all disclosure stories end in support or understanding. In this section, every contributor chose to remain anonymous, a reflection of the real professional risk many trainees still associate with disclosure. One resident shared what happened after disclosing a diagnosis just before starting residency.
Sometimes I wonder what is keeping me going at this point. Is it spite or fear or anger? I would have never thought something like this would happen to me. Discriminated against, ostracized by my program, all because of this diagnosis, and within my first 9 months of residency. I was diagnosed with my disability weeks before starting residency. As I saw my physician in clinic prior to graduation, she was optimistic in my ability to manage my diagnosis, regardless of my residency program, as she had witnessed the success of residents with my diagnosis for years during her time in practice. However, I will never forget the cautionary advice she imparted with me at our last visit. You will need to establish care as soon as you get to residency.
But establishing care proved nearly impossible. Even more troubling, the person assigned to support the resident, the program's disability advocate, turned their very first meeting into an interrogation. It's a pattern echoed in recent work by Anderson and colleagues. Sometimes the call is coming from inside the house. The very people assigned to help you can harm you.
Once orientation started, I met with my first independent disability advocate. What was supposed to be a meeting to discuss accommodations quickly turned into an interrogation session. Without my consent, my private medical documents were sent by my program to the HR office. The advocate then used my previous medical documents against me, suggesting independent concerns with my ability to become a resident physician were valid, while never mentioning once reasonable accommodations that could be offered in the first place. Even after transitioning to another advocate, I was met with equal amounts of pushback. She goes so far as to suggest, for my own safety and future success, that I transfer to another program because of the intensity of this scrutiny. As I continue to experience what I can only describe as being the worst period of my life, I regret every day even mentioning anything remotely close to my disability with my program. While I wish this was not the case, the moment you disclose, you are no longer an individual. You are no longer just another resident physician. You are a walking problem forever labeled as your diagnosis. People whisper about your diagnosis, judge your clinical performance using different and more harsh methods, and seamlessly forget your reality of a new resident and the common psychological and emotional tolls that it brings with it.
This story reflects a worst-case scenario, an example of institutional betrayal that helps explain why so many trainees choose not to disclose in the first place. Forced disclosure can be just as destabilizing. Another anonymous medical student shared what happened when their exam accommodations were processed incorrectly.
At my medical school, the second week of classes, you do like a mock exam. It's not a grade, but it's just for you to get the feel of the exam. And they messed up my accommodations. So I had like the separate environment, but I also get extended time, and they forgot to put it on that. And I didn't realize until I was in the middle of the exam, and I was like, oh, that's not the timing it should be. So I completed the exam, or I didn't finish the exam, but it timed out. And I went up to the proctor and I told her about the situation. What ended up happening is within about an hour, I got emails from a ridiculous amount of people, some people that are very important at my medical school that are not related in any way to my classes, saying that they apologize.
Until that moment, the student had not disclosed their disability to any of these administrators, so they were very confused by the onslaught of emails.
I was really freaking out during that time because I hadn't chosen to tell them about my disability. There was no reason why the student deans, like the head of our undergraduate curriculum, like all these people who are not directly involved with my classes should know about this until I tell them. This was the second week of medical school. I've never spoken to these people. And suddenly all these people were like, let's have meetings. Like, what happened? We apologize.
Accommodations in medicine often require coordination across roles, which means some information has to be shared. In well-designed systems, that process is led by a disability resource specialist who serves as a single point of contact. Learners are told in advance who will receive information, what will be shared, and why. This transparency supports the process rather than undermining trust.
It was just very overwhelming, and it really stressed me out, especially because there's not like a disability office at my medical school. It was just like a person of contact. I kind of just decided, okay, well, if I'm already in this position, I'm just kind of going to advocate for the other students. I started reaching out to them, and they actually hired a new student liaison my second semester of medical school. And one of his tasks is specifically working with the students with disabilities. Being told that situation was one of the things that made them really aware that they needed more help in this situation.
Experiences like these point to something larger than individual missteps. When systems are unclear or poorly designed, disclosure can happen in ways that leave learners feeling exposed rather than supported.
Section 6. Mental Health Disclosure, Invisible and Misunderstood.
Disclosure doesn't look the same across all disabilities. For mental health conditions in particular, invisibility and stigma shape the risks in distinct ways. Dr. Jessie Gold, Chief Wellness Officer at the University of Tennessee System, explains why.
There's an invisibility to it that makes it complicated, and a misunderstanding of it that makes it complicated, which is compounded by culture and cultural understanding, compounded by the culture of medicine. If a resident asked off because they needed to go to chemotherapy, it would make a lot of sense and they would feel really bad for the person. But if the person asked off to go to an intensive outpatient program, I think they'd be like, well, what's that about? Should they even be a doctor? And that's a weird difference.
This quote-unquote weird difference leads many to stay silent. One physician who experienced a mental health emergency at age 44 described the long-term implications.
At the age of 44, I suffered a significant mental health emergency. This followed years of stress and lack of sleep due to medical training and practice. It began with months of only sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, followed by a period of 3 days when I didn't sleep at all, which led to psychosis. As far as my career, disclosure was one of the first and primary concerns.
The immediate disclosure to a trusted colleague was manageable.
I texted our lead physician and said I was sick and could not come into work that day. My office sent me an edible bouquet. It was nice, and I was thankful that they trusted me without asking lots of questions.
But the longer-term questions were harder to resolve.
Do I owe it to them to disclose what happened in case I make mistakes? Did my patients notice something was wrong before I did? In telling them, am I just making them second-guess everything? Had my partners noticed mistakes or changes in my behavior and not told me? Were there signs they could identify in case it happens again? Do I need to disclose the event to future employers and colleagues with which I have no established relationship?
This highlights a central tension in disclosure. It's deeply personal and highly situational. While disclosure should always be a choice, in practice it can feel less optional, especially when accessing accommodations or support requires revealing some part of a disability identity.
Section 7. Legal protections and their limits.
That loss of choice around disclosure is something I discussed with Elizabeth Pendo, a professor of law at the University of Washington who specializes in disability law. We talked about what legal protections exist and where the limits of those protections begin.
If we're thinking about physicians or healthcare providers with disabilities, then I would be thinking about the employment protections of Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're an interesting combination of privacy protections and use protections. So your employer cannot ask you if you have a disability when you're applying for a job or when you're already employed. But if you want a reasonable accommodation, you have to request it, and therefore you would be disclosing.
This creates a paradox. Disclosure is protected, but it's also required to access support. And many clinicians worry about what happens after that moment.
People have concerns that once it's disclosed or perceived, they'll be treated differently, perhaps in ways that the law can't reach or that they can't prove. And those are very real concerns, and that's why a lot of people do not disclose their disabilities.
Section 8, What We Hope For.
This series exists because disclosure shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't require such careful calculation, especially in systems meant to support learning and care. To help us think about what could change, we again turn to Dr. Irene Sturgiopoulos, who reflected on what greater transparency might make possible.
I think the greatest thing would be for students who, or residents or physicians who've never disclosed, to be able to hear this podcast and just know the lay of the land and feel safer in disclosing if they need to, because knowledge is power. I think so many people don't disclose because they don't know what's on the other side of the disclosure. They don't know what the experience is once you open that door and say, hello, I have a disability. That lack of knowledge is terrifying. And so people are going unaccommodated because there's no transparency.
For some, the hope is normalization. Dr. Carla Castro-Frenzel reflects on what it would mean for physicians facing illness or disability to feel less alone and less afraid.
I really hope this series helps normalize a little bit more, for lack of a better term, physicians when they do get sick, even if it's with a really terrible diagnosis, that there can be hope, there can be ways to still, be relevant and feel whole. And I hope that it helps decrease fear among physicians facing illness, to know that there are others out there that have faced similar circumstances. And I think the more stories about physicians facing disability, facing illness challenges is good for the medical culture as we continue to improve it, continue to curate a safer environment for our physicians.
And now we return to Dr. Jessie Gold with a reminder about autonomy and the right to choose if, when, and how to share your story.
I believe your story is your story to tell however and whenever you want to, if you choose to. I think people feel like they owe people certain elements of their story. We owe people nothing. There's this belief that if I tell people that that's okay, that I'm allowing stigma to continue. And I'm not, really. I'm helping them keep their privacy, and they can tell that story if and when they want to. That's their story.
Disclosure is deeply personal. It's shaped by disability, identity, institutional culture, mentorship, and tolerance for risk. It isn't a single decision, it's an ongoing practice, negotiated within systems that often claim to value diversity while quietly enforcing normalcy. What we've heard today is that disclosure can be many things at once. It can be necessary for access, it can build community, it can open the door to advocacy and change, and it can also expose people to harm. The data tell us that about 9% of medical trainees report having a disability, but that number should be higher. Only about half of those who need accommodations disclose. What we've heard helps explain why. When disclosure feels risky or unpredictable, many choose silence. And that tells us that the system still isn't safe. Stories like the ones you've heard today begin to change that. They create transparency. They help people understand what's on the other side of disclosure and what still needs to improve. Thank you for joining us for the first episode of our Disclosure series. In episode 2, we'll turn our attention to the medical culture itself, the stigma, norms, and unspoken expectations that shape disclosure. From there, we'll begin asking the harder questions, how these systems can change. To everyone who shared their story, thank you for your trust. To those listening who are weighing disclosure for themselves, you're not alone. And to everyone, disability is not something to hide. It's part of the human experience and deserves to be part of our profession. This series is supported by a grant from the Ford Foundation, the National Institute on Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Special thanks to all of our contributors, both named and anonymous.